Here is the story behind the story. It was written by the master of Gothic horror, Edgar Allan Poe, and was first published in May 1842. This date holds a heartbreaking significance. Just 4 months earlier, in January of that same year, Poe's beloved wife, Virginia, was singing and playing the piano when she suddenly coughed up bright red blood. It was the first sign of tuberculosis, the incurable disease that would eventually consume her. Critics believe that witnessing this scarlet horror on the lips of the woman he loved inspired the Red Death itself, a plague where blood was its avatar and its seal. In this shadow, Poe penned a tale not just of a pestilence, but of the futile attempt to lock out death itself. The story begins in a land devastated by this horrific plague. It is fatal, it is hideous, and it is swift. To escape it, the bold and eccentric Prince Prospero summons 1,000 of his healthy and light-hearted friends to a secluded, fortified abbey. He welds the iron gates shut, determined to let no one in or out. Inside, they have every pleasure imaginable: musicians, dancers, beauty, and wine. Inside, there is security. Outside, there is the Red Death. About 5 or 6 months into their seclusion, Prince Prospero decides to hold a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It is held within a bizarre suite of 7 multicolored rooms. But can welded gates and a grand party truly keep death at bay? Let us begin the Masque of the Red Death. The Red Death had ravaged the country for a long time. No disease had ever been so fatal or so truly hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. It was the redness and the sheer horror of blood itself. The symptoms began with sharp pains and sudden dizziness. Then came profuse bleeding from the pores, followed by the body's rapid dissolution. Scarlet stains appeared upon the body, especially on the victim's face. These marks were a ban that shut the sufferer out from all aid and from the sympathy of their fellow men. The entire progression of the disease, from the first seizure to the final termination, took a mere half an hour. Yet, Prince Prospero remained happy, dauntless, and wise. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned 1,000 healthy and light-hearted friends to his presence. He chose them from among the knights and dames of his court. Together, they retired to the deep seclusion of one of his fortified abbeys. It was an extensive and magnificent structure, created by the prince's own eccentric yet majestic taste. A strong, lofty wall girdled the entire place. This wall had massive gates of iron. Once the courtiers had entered, they brought furnaces and heavy hammers to weld the bolts shut. They resolved to leave no means of entrance or exit. They wanted to bar any sudden impulses of despair from within or frenzy from without. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers felt they might bid defiance to the contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were clowns and improvisational poets. There were ballet dancers and musicians. There was beauty and there was wine. All of these things, along with safety, were inside. Outside was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion. While the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends. He held a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. The masquerade was a scene of pure luxury, but before describing the guests, the rooms themselves must be pictured. There were 7 of them, forming an imperial suite. In many palaces, such suites form a long, straight line where the folding doors slide back to the walls. In those places, one can see the entire length of the hall without obstruction. Here, the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were arranged so irregularly that one's vision could embrace little more than one room at a time. There was a sharp turn every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn, a novel effect was revealed. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor. This corridor followed the winding path of the suite. These windows were made of stained glass. Their color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations in the room they opened into. The room at the eastern end was hung, for example, in blue, and so its windows were vividly blue. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the window casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, and the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries. They hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same dark material. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in none of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum. Golden ornaments lay scattered about or hung from the roof, but no light of any kind came from a lamp or candle within the suite itself. Instead, in the corridors outside, there stood a heavy tripod opposite each window, bearing a brazier of fire. This fire projected its rays through the tinted glass and glaringly illuminated the room. This produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect was different. The firelight streaming upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme. It produced so wild a look on the faces of those who entered that few were bold enough to set foot inside that room at all. It was also in this room that a gigantic ebony clock stood against the western wall. Its pendulum swung back and forth with a dull, heavy, and monotonous clang. When the minute hand completed its circle and the hour was to strike, a sound erupted from the clock's brass lungs. It was clear, loud, deep, and exceedingly musical. However, the note and emphasis were so peculiar that the musicians of the orchestra were forced to pause in their performance to listen. As a result, the waltzers stopped their dancing. A brief uneasiness fell over the entire gay company. While the chimes of the clock still rang, it was observed that even the wildest guests grew pale. The older and more serious ones passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused daydream or deep meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, light laughter instantly filled the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled, as if mocking their own nervousness and folly. They whispered promises to one another that the next chiming of the clock would produce no such emotion in them. Yet, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraces 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, the clock struck again. And with it came the same silence, trembling, and meditation as before. Despite these interruptions, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a keen eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the standard conventions of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his designs glowed with a wild, barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not, but it was necessary to hear, see, and touch him to be sure that he was not. Prince Prospero had personally directed the decorations for this great party. It was his own guiding taste that gave character to the masqueraders. And be sure they were grotesque. There was much glare, glitter, and sharp contrast. It was a scene of phantasms and theatrical drama. There were figures with strange, arabesque patterns and mismatched limbs. There were delirious fancies, the kind a madman might fashion in his mind. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wild, and much of the bizarre. There was something of the terrible, and not a little that might have excited disgust. In fact, a multitude of living dreams stalked back and forth through the 7 chambers. These dreams writhed in and out of the shadows, taking their color from the rooms they entered. It made the wild music of the orchestra seem like the echo of their own footsteps. Then the ebony clock in the velvet hall would strike. For a moment all was still. All was silent, save for the voice of the clock. The dreams stood stiff and frozen where they were. But the echoes of the chime would die away. They endured but for an instant. A light, nervous laughter floated after the sound as it departed. Now the music swelled again, and the dreams lived once more. They writhed back and forth more merrily than ever. They took color from the many-tinted windows, through which streamed the rays from the tripods outside. However, there were now no maskers who ventured into the westernmost chamber of the 7. The night was waning away, and a ruddier light flowed through the blood-colored panes. The blackness of the dark drapes was terrifying. To anyone whose foot fell upon that black carpet, the sound was different. From the nearby ebony clock came a muffled peal. It was more solemn and heavy than any sound heard by those in the distant, happier rooms. But these other rooms were densely crowded. In them the heart of life beat feverishly. The revelry whirled on until, at last, the clock began to strike midnight. Then the music stopped. The dancing came to a halt. An uneasy stillness fell over everything, just as it had before. But this time the bell had to sound 12 strokes. Because it took longer, more thoughts crept into the minds of the revelers. The silence stretched out, allowing reflection to intrude upon their fun. And so it happened. Before the final echo of the last chime had faded into total silence, something changed. Many people in the crowd had time to notice a masked figure. It was a presence that no one had spotted before. News of this new guest spread in whispers. A low buzz rose from the entire company. At first, it was a murmur of disapproval and surprise, but then it turned into terror, horror, and finally, disgust. In such a wild assembly of phantasms, no ordinary appearance could have caused such a sensation. The license for the night was nearly unlimited, but this figure had exceeded all bounds. He had gone beyond even the prince's loose standards of decency. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless that cannot be touched without emotion. Even for those who consider life and death to be mere jokes, there are matters that cannot be mocked. The whole company felt deeply that this stranger possessed neither wit nor propriety. The figure was tall and gaunt. He was shrouded from head to foot in the garments of the grave. The mask that concealed his face was made to look exactly like the countenance of a stiffened corpse. It was so realistic that even the closest scrutiny would have had difficulty detecting the cheat. Yet even this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers. But this stranger had gone so far as to mimic the Red Death itself. His clothing was dabbled in blood. His broad forehead, and all the features of his face, were sprinkled with the scarlet horror. Prince Prospero watched this spectral image. The figure moved with a slow and solemn step, as if to fully sustain its role, stalking back and forth among the waltzers. Upon seeing him, the prince convulsed. At first, he shuddered with a mix of terror and disgust, but in the next moment, his brow reddened with rage. He demanded hoarsely to know who dared to insult them with such blasphemous mockery. He ordered the courtiers standing near him to seize the man and unmask him immediately. He declared that they needed to know whom they would hang from the battlements at sunrise. The prince stood in the eastern or blue chamber as he uttered these words. His voice rang loudly and clearly throughout the 7 rooms. He was a bold and robust man, and at the waving of his hand, the music had been hushed. It was a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder. But at that moment, the figure was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made a closer approach to the speaker. However, from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth a hand to seize him. So, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person. The vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls. He made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step. He moved from the blue chamber to the purple, from the purple to the green, from the green to the orange, from this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers. None followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger. He had approached, in rapid impetuosity, to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure. Then, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, the stranger turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry. The dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterwards, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero.